decision because I loved aviation and spent 30 years at it.
Thanks, Charles. We're actually going to, I got two microphones going here, sorry. We're actually going to talk about your training experiences from the Stearman to the BT-13 and moving on to the P-51. So talk to us a little bit what it was like to start out just flying a Stearman, because I know that can be a bit of a handful from time to time and like a crosswind. And then a little bit about kind of moving up into the BT and then eventually the Mustang. So kind of tell us a little bit about your training experiences.
Well, that's something, you know, the Stearman was an open cockpit, and you kind of listen to the wind through the wing struts to know that we're flying at the right speed and doing something, and the 25 is flying overhead again. We moved from the primary training in the PT-17. Later they flew PT-19s, but that wasn't part of my experience. But basic training was the, we called it the Volt-T vibrator, BT-13. But each step is more, as I say, primary open cockpit. You hollowed, the instructor hollowed through a tube. You could sometimes understand what he was saying or what you were trying to say. BT-13 closed cockpit, a few more instruments, a couple more 100 horsepower in the engine, moving from basic to advanced. AT-6 Texan, again, a couple hundred more horsepower, but by that time you're in the closed cockpit, and then you begin to learn, well, you've already learned how to fly and maneuver the aircraft, but now you learn some of the formation combat experiences, how to fire guns and so on, and that's always been an amazing part of my experience. I couldn't hit the side of a barn with a pistol, but I learned to shoot expert aerial gunnery, and I've never figured out how that came about. But from my first flight, I just knew I'd made the right decision, and as he said, flying a lot of different aircraft, I made myself available besides the primary job. If they had C-47 on the ramp and need to go pick up some supplies or take somebody to school, I'm ready. I volunteered. They need the test stop. Normally after maintenance, they want to give an aircraft a 15 or 20-minute flight to be sure all is well before they put it back on the line. I did that too. So I did that really all through my career so many times. And if you want to ask me what my most favorite experience flying is, it would be on one of those occasions. Can't do it now because things cost too much. You know, we're costing ourselves out a lot of fun and business these days. But back in my day, if there was an aircraft in commission you wanted to go fly, you could. But folks, to be able to get in an aircraft at sunset, climb up to 40, I'm talking jet age now, climb up to 40,000 feet and see the sunset again, see the stars come out, you begin to realize that we human beings are one small aspect in a mighty grand universe. But that's the love of flying. Somebody asks you, I can't tell you the feeling. You have to get it for yourself.
You know, Charles, what we're going to do is we're actually going to talk a little bit about that feeling. And the P-51 Mustang, particularly the C model, has been kind of like the iconic representation of the Tuskegee Airman. So I was fortunate to have a little bit of backseat time in like our D model, and it was just almost a magic experience flying with the P-51. But tell us a little bit about kind of the first time, if you can recollect back, or you got in a Mustang. What's kind of the experience that you kind of go through flying something that fast?
You know, there's always a prelude to that because we were checked out. The first fighter was the P-40 Warhawk, and you all know about the history of the P-40, and then later only the 99th Squadron flew it in combat, went to North Africa, Sicily, into Italy. We were combat ready in the P-40, and he said, well, you are going to do some patrol work. we switched P-39 Bell Air Cobra. Well, we were trying to use an interceptor, and that wasn't the case. Wasn't a good aircraft for that. I called it a good photo op aircraft. You know, they'll open the door and let the wind blow your scarf, and that's a good picture. But we went directly to Italy, flew the P-39, patrolling Naples Harbor and the waterways up the Anzio beachhead that was established to cut off the German retreat before Rome. But the 332nd Fighter Group was one of 4 groups picked to begin the escort work. We thought we had enough guns on our B-17s and B-24s to protect them from the German aircraft, and that wasn't the case. So they needed escort to protect them. 4 groups were picked from 12th Tactical Air Force to move to 15th Air Force and begin the escort. P-39 was not the aircraft for the job. So there in combat, we picked up P-47 Thunderbolt. Good big radial engine, very roomy cockpit, very nice, but that big nose limited its range and altitude to performance, and we didn't have it but about 3 months, and then we got that P-51 Mustang, and the first ones we flew is that red tail up the ramp that you see. That's a P-51 C model. B and C were pretty much the same. You can see it's the canopy, we call it Razorback. The canopy runs into the back of the fuselage. Later, the D model, the canopy is above the fuselage, and of course that gave us much greater visibility if we could turn our neck around far enough to see. But I always have to modify. Folks say, "What's your favorite aircraft?" It'll be the P-51 Mustang, but with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. There's our B-25. That's in that. But then the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave us speed, range, and altitude that no other of our American aircraft had. You know, we built it for the English, and they put the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in. We said, that's a good thing. And we put it to use. It's hard to tell somebody that feeling, but that aircraft with the laminar flow wing was just something that we had not had and experienced before, and so it made a wonderful platform for us to do the job. And I might, just a little side, someone say, well, why the red nose and the red tail? I mentioned 4 groups were picked to begin the escort work, and the gunners on the bombers needed to recognize when we approached that we weren't German Focke-Wulf or Messerschmitts. Up in that altitude, aircraft don't look that much different. And so of the 4 groups, one had a yellow tail, one had a candy stripe, one had a checkerboard tail. 332nd Fighter Group ended up with the red tail. So that's how that story came about. So those gunners knew we were friendly. We were coming there to give them a hand, help save lives, not to get in their way of accomplishing the job that they had to do. But the Mustang, as I say, gave us an aircraft that good from the ground to 35,000 feet. And it's interesting, the B-17s could fly higher than the B-24s, so we often wanted to be even a couple thousand feet above them, so it gave us even a better craft than the P-47 to escort B-17 groups when we were signed with them. So P-51 became a signature aircraft that all old fighter pilots still love. And with that engine, it can fly over. You don't need to look up. If you've had the experience, you know it's a P-51 with the Rolls-Royce engine. And that was it. And by the way, folks often wonder about, we were with the 12th and 15th Air Force, the 12th Tactical Air Force and 15th Strategic Air Force out of the Mediterranean Theater. The 8th and 9th Air Force are the folks doing the same type of work but flying out of England.
Absolutely, Charles. We're actually going to come to that, especially your point about saving lives. So part of the tactical direction I think with the Tuskegee Airmen, particularly like with the 15th Air Force in Italy, was really kind of close escort with the bombers. And I think probably that tactic probably saved the lives of many folks that were flying the bombers, right? And enabled them to come back to the U.S. after World War II. And you know, one of the talking points I had with Don Hines a number of years back, sitting under the left wing of that P-51, is, you know, you said that sometimes the Italy and the Mediterranean was characterized as, well, maybe it wasn't as ferocious, or there weren't as many liftoff aircraft. But actually, the research showed that a lot of the experts that were in like JG-26, 53, and 77, the really top liftoff pilots were actually spending time in Italy. So they were fighting against the varsity. And I think it showed a lot of great discipline, you know, escorting the bombers and saving lives rather than kind of chasing, you know, one or two aircraft that may come up after the bombers. But I kind of want to pick up on your air combat experience with your FW-190 victory. So I'm going to kind of start the story. You're flying along doing close escort, and all of a sudden you see some specks way out in the distance.
Well, you know, that's part of the story, and part of the experience, so that folks understand history. Those folks flying out of England were much closer to the German air forces, and there was great concern of the damage had they carried it out. Unfortunately, they got some bad leadership from Hitler and didn't do it. They could have destroyed England, but that's a different history. But their focus was, if there are aircraft in the air, go get them. But they often left the bombers to do that. In our area, under B.O. Davis Jr., we had the idea that our job there was to save American lives, because as you know, every bomber that went down, if there was losses, usually that's 10 American. That's what we were there to do. And B.O. Davis I always say, raise second and first lieutenants that would like to become aces. Your job is to stick with the bombers, and we did that. My one victory came, and we flew, generally each squadron putting up 16 aircraft, and we're flying along. Up above him, but we're sitting up at most of the 24s, usually 22, 24,000 feet, B-17s, 26,000 maybe. And if they could get higher, they had to follow the leader, but they would get up higher because they'd get out of the flak zone. The German gunners knew pretty much what altitude they were flying in at, and that flak was just like a blanket out there. You could see it. Well, had to salute the bomber pilots. We could steal our job and climb another couple thousand feet to get out of that fire burst that the ground fire was putting up to destroy our bombers. But as we went along, if our bomb group was attempt attack, the lead would dispatch whoever would need, whichever side, and it happened that there in August of '44, over part of beach, our targets were a nearby rail yard and Portabeachy airdrome, and both Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitts came up into the air, and Focke-Wulf tried to approach our bombers. My element was detached and got on the tail. The bomber, things happen very rapidly. It's only a minute or two or three at the most that you're involved. But he thought he could get away by diving away from the formation, and I got on his tail, and all I can say, unfortunately, had he maybe turned to the left over the airfield, I might not have got a bead on him. He made a right turn, but put perfect, and unfortunately the plane crashed on the airfield. I don't know whether the pilot got out and never was able to determine that. But that's the way that happens, and then it's climb back out. In my case, there was a lot of ground fire from the airfield, so I stayed at low altitude getting away, and also had a chance to fire on and put a little destruction on passing a rail yard. I saw an engine pulling in with a few, so I demolished the engine for a little bit before I climbed back up the altitude to head back home. But those things happen. But you have to understand what that leadership meant, that our job was saving American lives. And if some of you look in the history, it even came to the point that many of the bomber pilots, even well after the war, did not know that the Red Tails were black pilots, but they knew that the Red Tails gave them close formation and didn't run away just because German aircraft were in the air. And it's been said that they requested the Red Tails and ended up B.O. Davis put by request as the name on his aircraft. And by the way, I put Kitten was on mine. It was my wife's nickname, but also said my crew chief kept that engine purring like a kitten, so put it on both sides.
That's great, Charles. Let's kind of talk a little bit as we get kind of toward the end of the war, and I think some of your service in Korea and also Vietnam. So the air battles at the end of '44 were probably some of the most fierce, because Hitler knew that if the ground forces for the Allies made it in through Italy and started to advance with the invasion, it was all over. And there were stories that said as soon as Hermann Goering saw Mustangs over Berlin, he said, we should just fold, we're done for. And so that was kind of a defining moment. But beyond your FW-190 victory that you have, this could be like the end of the day the war ended, or whatever. What's kind of one thing, kind of a defining moment that you kind of remember, toward the end of the war?
Well, that question I probably can't answer directly, because the gentleman you talked to earlier was there at that time. I was overseas from January to November of '44, and since the war didn't really end in the spring of '45, I missed some of those late formations, but our early were a lot of the long range we were destroying Germany's war-making potential, the oil fields, the factories and so on, where they were building aircraft and building Navy support equipment, all of that. So it was a lot of long range, high altitude bombing. Then we had the opportunity that if it was bad weather and bombers didn't get in the air, we also were assigned fighter sweeps. That was a great time to be able to go find an airfield or a factory, whatever you could find. If there was something moving, kill it, shoot it down. So the fighter sweeps were also a great opportunity. And when we look at the history, we probably destroyed as many German aircraft at the airfields on the ground as we did in the air battles. But that was a great part of our assignments. So not only doing the escort, one of my favorite missions also, the partisans in Yugoslavia protected troops, kept them out of German hands when their aircraft were lost. And it was highly classified at the time, but they had missions where they cleared a special airstrip and sent in, well, at one time it was stripped down B-17s, and another time C-47s to bring back. So we helped get many of the Americans back home, escorting those efforts to bring them back out of Yugoslavia and get them back home. And those are the types of things that make you feel good about what you accomplished, and as I say, the leadership that we had. Folks, often the young folks say, were you scared? And I say, if you're scared, you're in the wrong business. But we had excellent training and were able to carry it out. And really, I know many of you don't know, the policy came from a 1925 War College study saying that because of our ethnicity and birth, we didn't have intelligence of the white person, we didn't have the integrity, you name it, we were subspecies, second-class citizen, couldn't do anything technical. And we dispelled those, and I say biases, generalizations, in some cases racist ideas that were part of policy. But as I say, we still have a long way to go, folks, because I often tell folks in the late 50s, when I was interested in getting out of military flying, wanted to go commercial, They weren't interested in me, or they weren't interested in any of you ladies out there at that time. It took lawsuits in the 60s, but by that time I was stuck, but I had great opportunities. And it's interesting, the Army never changed the policy. Folks, the war ended. Our Air Force became a separate service. It was the Air Force that decided they needed to use people based on training and experience and where needed, not their happenstance of birth. And they're not getting enough money to keep then Lockburn Air Base open, but separate and meet their requirements. They need to integrate. Their decision was backed by a very courageous President, Harry Truman, who said he issued he issued 2 executive orders, 9981, all of the services need to integrate. Well, unfortunately, the Navy and Army didn't really get on board till Korea time frame, but the Air Force closed the Tuskegee base in July of '49. We were scattered around the world. But to show you how things go, you all know the Air Force always had a big gunnery meet to have the fighters come in and put on a show and so on. And I don't know what year it was, but finally they needed to write the history, and unfortunately the Air Force historian, the winners of the first Air Force gunnery meet in May of 1949, unknown. Guess who they were? Pilots 332nd Fighter Group flying P-47Ns. Well, they found the trophy in the basement of the Air Force Museum, and a couple of the pilots and mechanics were still living, so that history got straightened out too. But even then, folks, this is important. I hope all the adults out there are mentoring some young people like this young lady up front here. That's needed so much today, because even our schools aren't letting our youngsters know where technology is taking us. They're the future of our country. We need to do that. So if you don't have a youngster in your family, there might be a neighbor or down the street, find them, because they need the right advice for the future of our country. But our experience, as I say, dispelled the biases and generalizations and thoughts that have become a part of Army policy, and we still have some things to fight. And am I taking too much time?
No, you're good.
He's got more questions, but for those of you who are historians out there, the now called Tuskegee experience should be considered in 5 phases. Phase 1. Story of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first squadron that the Army said, this is an experiment, we know it's going to fail. And to tell you, I learned about the program because the mechanics, Army said we can't use a black pilot because we don't have any black mechanics. The mechanics were in training at Chanute Field, Rantoul, Illinois, expected to fail, and they didn't. They said, my gosh, we need an airfield for pilot training. Airfields all around the country, but they found $4 million to build Tuskegee Army Airfield. Pilot training began a year later there, but the 99th wasn't wanted. They were attached to white groups. Colonel Momeyer said, we only shot down 1 aircraft, so the nice sound for listen. That's a Mustang. There we go. The Momeyer said they're not aggressive, only shot down 1 aircraft. And this is a challenge to your history, and if you know how things are laid out. What were they patrolling Liberia? Were there any Germans in Liberia? Well, I think you understand. But that brought a hearing in Washington. Out of that hearing, they wanted to get the 99th out of combat, but they had a study done, realized their bombs on target and what they were doing was equal to the other squadrons. Coming out of Africa into Sicily into Italy, and I say there was one bit of integration because Bill Bates of the 79th Fighter Group was just glad to have more pilots and more aircraft. And in a 7-day time frame during that Anzio beachhead, 99th pilots shot down 16 German aircraft. So it was a matter of opportunity. But they're still flying the P-40. We were flying the P-39 patrolling Naples Harbor. This 332nd Fighter Group is the second phase of the experience. The 100th, 301st, and 302nd Squadron. Combat rating, the P-40, know you are going to do patrol. Switch to the P-39, but one of the four groups picked to begin the escort work. P-39 was not an interceptor. Terrible. Good for ground interdiction and so on, but not good for escort. We gave the P-39 to the Russians and picked up P-47 Thunderbolts in combat and began the escort with P-47. Nice time. And eventually in July of 44, we got the P-51 Mustang B's and C's that you see up the ramp. Later in the war, although I'd come home, they got the D model of the 51. But also when the group got the P-51, they stopped attaching the 99 to white groups, and we ended up with 4 squadrons from July 44 on through the end of the war. And as I say, on most escort missions, each squadron putting up 16 aircraft. Many of the bomber pilots many years after didn't know that those red tails were black pilots. But the story of the 32nd is the second phase. When I graduated, my instructor said, "Too bad they don't have bomber training for you guys, because I think you'd make a good bomber pilot." I didn't ask him why, because I was enjoying what I was doing. 477th Bomb Group Medium, B-25. Training began 2 months later there at Tuskegee. 4 squadrons, and folks, with all of the necessary support. So, don't you like that sound? We think about 16 of them taking off and joining up to go do the job. But that's the world of yeah. In that phase for the bomb group, I hope both of you know a little bit of history. I think it was the Pittsburgh Courier said we were fighting for 2 victories, double V, victory against Hitler in Europe, victory against racism here at home. The bomb group didn't get into combat because we dropped a big bomb and training ended before they were fully ready to go, but they fought the battle against training. Even though the Army regulations already said there should be no segregation based on race, creed, and color, and that type of thing. Colonel Selway still said, no, we don't want to mix blacks and whites, and we don't want white soldiers saluting black officers. So he had General Hunter's okay to say on his base, trainees can only use the facilities he designated. Well, who's in training? 477 Bomb Group. Building A is White Officers Club. You use Building B over on the other side of the field. Army rate, and back then, they took your club dues out of your pay before you got the money. So officers already had paid for their dues. The bomb group, the 477th officers knew Army regulations. Peacefully in 2s and 3s says, we'll go to the club, the club. They were denied. Colonel Selway's upset, called them in, said, I'd like you to reread my regulation and sign that you'll abide. 101 refused and were immediately shipped from Godman Field, Kentucky to, or rather from Seymour, Indiana to Godman Field, Kentucky, behind barbed wire, dogs, guards. In fact, German prisoners of war had more freedoms at the adjacent Fort Knox, certainly, at that time. But that brought a hearing. That hearing, I don't know, they shipped Selway off because they knew he was wrong. But the Army said, we've really got a problem. The war's over in Europe and all these pilots back from the 332nd. Well, we'll have the 3rd phase of the experience, we'll have a composite group. We'll keep 2 of the B-25 squadrons, we'll reactivate the 99th. Godman Field's too small. That's when they opened up the segregated base of Lockburn Air Base, now Rickenbacker Air Base, for those who know the history, near Columbus, Ohio. When training ended in 46, those of us in Tuskegee, where'd we go? Lockburn Air Base in Ohio. That's the third phase of the experience. But Lockburn at the time was under Tactical Air Command, and I guess tactical doesn't mean B-25s. I don't know what happened, but the next phase of the experience became reactivation of the 332nd Fighter Group, and those were the ones that I'd say were flying the P-47N and fought, won the trophy for fighter gunnery in the first Air Force meet. But the Air Force closed Lockburn Air Base 1st of July 1949, and we were scattered around the world for sure.
Absolutely. Charles, I'm going to pick up on that a little bit, right? Because we were talking about Charles A. Train Dryden last night about the movie, and Charles Dryden told me, he goes, you know, Kevin, he says, one thing about an airplane is it doesn't know who's flying it. It doesn't matter if you're male, female, white, black, Asian, it doesn't matter at all, right? All it knows is really what the pilot tells it to do. He says that's the beauty of it. It's kind of like the great equalizer. But you know, you had picked out a couple of folks here that are kind of younger, that may be interested in aviation or flying or being a pilot or something like this. What sort of advice could you give them, Charles? And then I got one more question for you about Mustangs.
Well, folks, I enjoyed a chance to talk to folks. In fact, I talked to one of the class groups that came out of the movie at the ramp. But there's a lot of things you can give them, and certainly the Rise Above exhibit has some key words that they give to the youngsters on the dog tag. But I've added 4 P's that you can take. Because see, the value lessons that helped us back in our day to accomplish are still good for the young folks today. But I say, tell the young folks, perceive, prepare, perform, persevere. Perceive, dream your dreams and find your talents. And I like to add, because I love my flying, find what you enjoy doing. You don't want to have to go to work every day but not liking what you have to do. But prepare. And unfortunately, too many of our schools aren't up to this standard, but learn to read, write, and speak well, and develop those talents that you perceive, because that's part of the future and what you're doing. But so perceive, prepare, perform. Are you doing your best? Always do your best in everything you do, but let excellence also be your goal in everything you do. That's good for not only yourself, your family, community, but for our country. And finally, persevere. We could have, because of circumstance, used that as an excuse to go off in the corner and say they don't like me, they don't want me, they call me names, and do nothing. What would have been accomplished? Don't let circumstances be an excuse for not achieving. So that's what I like to pass on. Thank you.